Hello and welcome to Revenue Rewired. And I should explain that Revenue Rewired is the new name for what was Digital Marketing Answered from the Innovation Visual team. And I'm very happy to be joined by Chris from our team today. Hello, Chris.
Hi Tim, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. I better do a little bit of explaining for all those loyal listeners and viewers out there about where Digital Marketing Answered has gone and where Revenue Rewired has appeared from. I think really the name change is a reflection of the way the world is going and the way that we see the world of marketing and also revenue generation going. I talk about revenue generation and the whole revenue cycle. So it's not just marketing and sales as separate entities, they're very much joined up now. And also bringing in customer service, customer retention. And I think, Chris, with your work, you've been seeing that as well with the whole joined up
Yeah,
revenue element.
yeah, massively. I think there's just been this blurring of lines between all these different areas of the revenue org. Traditionally, people worked in these silos, and we're just seeing that the way forward, the way we, to grow as a business is to break down those silos. A lot of that is around the technology, which we'll talk about, but it's about the people, it's about the processes, and we're just seeing, particularly the way we work with our clients, our remit's expanding, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, and I suppose the other part of the equation, if you like, so that's the revenue bit rather than talking about digital marketing, but the rewired element is that we're very much big believers in technology now being the strategic competitive advantage in many of these scenarios. Yes?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, like you say, that rewired part of the title, it's looking at how we restructure, how we approach things differently, how we use the technology better. It's not always a rip and replace thing, it is sometimes literally rewiring. So I think it's really apt.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. Otherwise, we haven't messed up the title from the outset.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and for those of you that maybe are new to Revenue Rewired and didn't listen to Digital Marketing Answered, we are an agency that's been around for more than a decade, and we've been providing this very tech-infused and data-infused delivery of services around the revenue generation element, which is what we're all about. So I think today's episode, what we want to do is just talk a bit more about the basics of the value element of technology. Yes?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, good stuff. So when we talk to new potential clients, we talk about the gold mine in their technology and data. How would you explain that to somebody who's listening today about what we mean by this gold mine that's there?
So for a lot of businesses over the, 5, 10, maybe 15 years, they've been adopting new systems, they've been collecting data, running marketing campaigns, holding events, whatever it might be. And they have been collecting primarily a lot of data that, as we said, maybe is living in a siloed system somewhere, or maybe the ownership of it sits with just the marketing team or just the sales team. And as a result, there's all this untapped value in that data, right? So whether it be contacts you've just not reached out to, or whether it be implicit and explicit data within there that we've not dug into, people are sitting on these gold mines where just a fresh approach or a new joined up way of looking at how we approach that data through new campaigns, new activities can just unlock that value. And it is that fresh approach and a different way of looking at how you join these dots up.
Yeah, I was thinking then when you were talking, I remember one of the conversations that we had not too long ago where we gave an example to a company that we were talking to, and we talked about the contacts that they had in their database that they weren't communicating with at all, that they could
Mm.
communicate with. And I remember at their current conversion rate, that equated to £600,000 worth of sales in, potential sales straight out the door. I mean, that really is a gold mine, isn't it? If you can extract that sort of value.
Yeah, it is. And sometimes when we look at these reviews or these audits of people's systems and their data, we kind of come to the conclusion of, look, if we activated just 5% of these contacts and then, like you say, go through their conversion rates, this is the value of it. And actually, that's quite conservative with well structured campaigns. you could be activating 10%, 20%. It will be different for every business, but that value is there. And I think it's a case of looking at how we connect the people and the processes within these businesses better
Yeah.
using technology.
Okay, well, why are people not doing it now? Like, if there's so much money being left on the table, so to speak, why are people not doing it now?
A lot of the time, it's down to historic decisions on how software was brought in, maybe, or how teams were structured. So, you've potentially got marketing teams that own certain tools and systems within the tech stack, and they have a remit of what they need to be delivering in terms of marketing qualified leads. And they've been doing that. Maybe they've been hitting their targets, maybe they haven't. But that remit's never been expanded to go, well, hang on, are we doing things like nurturing post event or nurturing post close lost? Are we putting opportunities back into the system? It can be quite simple things. And when you actually start to break it down, none of the things that we pull out for clients and push through as individual elements are that, game changing on their own. But when you start to add them all together, the big picture starts to really change how they've been approaching that data and where that value is coming from. So it's not that our clients or our prospects are incapable of seeing what we're seeing, it's just that they're not looking at it that way. And they have these silos in their teams where sales owns this, marketing owns that, customer success owns something else over here. And we just bring everything together, I think, and we help align that data, align those processes, and look at it differently and understand that there is value hidden in there.
Okay, I like that we look at things differently. So, in terms of like how that looking at it differently starts,
Mm.
like what do you know people listening, how should they start thinking differently about what they're doing?
I think it's seeing everything quite holistically, understanding that the big picture is all about aligning behind the right goals. So instead of getting your marketing team to focus on driving marketing qualified leads and your sales team to be closing at a certain cadence or whatever it might be, it's actually saying, look, these are the big picture goals, this is the business goals, and how do we align everybody behind that? And as you work through that process of understanding what does it take for marketing to work towards these revenue goals, you'll start finding the friction and the pinch points of, is it a process problem? Is it a system problem? Is it a data problem? And honestly, a lot of the time we find it's all of those things. There's
Yeah.
bad data in systems that aren't connected with people that have outdated processes. And that's just frustrating for everybody. You've got good people in good roles unable to do good work because they're being held back by these three things.
So the data, I mean, the connection of the data as well as the connectivity,
Mm.
siloed thinking sounds like something which is important to break down. And then obviously releasing the value of the people. So, in practical terms, you talked about data a few times, and I know we talk to new companies quite a lot about data. Why, is it important?
Yeah.
That's a
It's an
big
interesting one
question.
as well because data is not a particularly sexy thing that people want to spend a lot of time and resource on. It feels like a burden. It feels like maybe sometimes it's quite a daunting prospect. If we've got upwards of 100,000 contacts in a CRM or maybe even on a spreadsheet, it feels a lot to start going through and talking about things like data hygiene and is there still, are these still relevant and recent contacts? Is there any signs of engagement? But actually, what you need to be able to do is have this solid foundation of data, which does include things like making sure you've got well formatted data, making sure you haven't got loads of typos and email addresses, things that don't sound on the face of it that important,
Yeah,
because that data is what's going to allow you to do things like build really good audience segments. It's going to allow you to trigger automations based on that data. It's going to allow you to drive things like lead scoring so you can actually understand who these people are at scale.
yeah,
Because once we start talking about anything more than a few thousand contacts, your team can't manually stay on top of that. You need a system that's going to do it for you.
yeah,
And actually, a lot of our clients do have upwards of 100,000 contacts. It's not feasible for someone to be manually vetting those, to be
yeah,
staying on top of how segments are built.
yeah,
And, realistically, a lot of these databases are built out of lists that have come off the back of events or
yeah.
emails that have been scraped from salespeople. They don't necessarily have a good enriched
Yeah.
value to them.
I think part of the problem actually is that this resource constrained, high pressure, performance KPI orientated, we've got to hit our numbers, guys, got to hit the sales, we've got to hit the MQLs, got to hit the lead generation. I think people just skip over the data thing because,
Definitely.
as you say, it's a bit boring and dull. But also, actually, they don't understand what to get to grips with because it's not a salesperson's natural place or a sales manager's natural place, and it's typically not a marketing person's natural place. Or I'd love to dig into the data, and it's also almost never a full-time role.
Yeah.
You can't have somebody in house. It's just not worth it unless you've got huge amounts of things going on with your data. So you have to go to an external agency, but then you don't know what questions to ask. And I think that's the psychological bit. They just want to get straight to give me some leads. Just, we've come across people, haven't we, where it's just like, oh, we'll just get more contacts. We'll just spend more on paid. And you're like, do you realize how many contacts you've got in your database that are relevant, good fit,
Yeah.
ICP, and yet you're not doing anything with them? It's easy to go and spend money on paid campaigns or events, isn't it?
It is. And I think people come back from events and, from reading their kind of go-to magazines or whatever it might be, and they've picked up these buzzwords of things they should be doing. And these things are right. You should be doing things like lead scoring or automated nurture flows or automated sales outreach, whatever it is. But you can't just dive straight into those things without the foundations in place to allow you to do it. If
Yeah,
you can't segment your data because your data's not formatted correctly, if it's literally that simple, area codes or phone numbers or all these things have these structures in them that inherently make them useful. If that isn't there, you can't use them to segment. You can't drive segmented automation. It's that simple.
yeah, yeah. You mentioned data cleanliness. We were talking about this the other day in the context of
Mm.
a new company that we're engaging with. There's some pretty clever things now we can do to clean up data, aren't there?
Yeah, there are. I think gone are the days where it's just manually going through a spreadsheet and trying to work out clever filters to align things. There's so much that the heavy lifting technology can do for us now, whether it's using automation to scrape records, enrich records, pull in additional data, whether it's using AI. I think this is the first time we've mentioned AI in this
Yeah,
episode,
yeah,
but it's a big thing these days, as everyone knows. But a lot of people are not using it in this context. They're using the kind of the Gen AI side of things for creating content. And actually, the thing that AI is very good at is looking at big data sets and understanding them from a kind of human level very, very quickly. So something that a human would take hours and hours to go through,
yeah.
AI can just process it,
It's,
and therefore there's so much value there in tidying up your data.
yeah, there's a whole world of like pattern matching and things like that. And I think it's because people that don't understand how some of these AI elements work and work together, they refer back to things like, oh, we can't use AI because AI might hallucinate. And if in the context of cleaning up data, you shouldn't be setting something up in a way that actually should generate any hallucination if you're
Yeah.
actually using it right.
Yeah, we're not talking here about dropping a spreadsheet into ChatGPT and expecting miracles to come out. We're talking about structured flows that are built and designed to do this. And this is what we're now doing for clients, is
Yeah,
working out how we can provide that as a reliable flow that means that poor data can go in one end, good data can come out the other end, and we don't have worries around, data privacy or any of these things. So it's a real game changer.
yeah. Okay. Cleaning up the data, action point for people listening, just engage with somebody to help you through this, I think, is because you probably don't have the skills in-house or yourself. It's a different sort of mindset, but go get this sorted out so you can hit your targets later on. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So then if we're talking about extracting value from technology, what else is that going to mean? You've mentioned historic systems, legacy systems,
Mm.
and data sitting in different places. So if somebody wants to extract more value from their technology, what do they need to do at this point?
So I think the way to look at this is that your tech stack, the collection of software that you have as part of your revenue org, it needs to be greater than the sum of its parts. What a lot of people have is all these best in class systems, whether it's a CRM or email automation or sales outreach. There's loads of different elements to this, help desks and things. Each of these might be best in class. They might have been brought in last year, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and they're doing the job that they were brought in to do for the most part. But they've got so much untapped value in them. So we work a lot with HubSpot, and HubSpot does tens of thousands of things. Typically, people will buy it in for a handful of reasons. They need to do email marketing, they need to do automation, but it has so much more it can be doing. And that's true of Salesforce, it's true of Pardot. There's so many things these platforms can be doing, but the weak point is always these tools don't have access to the right data, or the wrong teams are using them, or there's crossover between these platforms because of the way that the organization has been set up, and therefore they're not being used to their full value. So you have best in class tools in silos that are not reaching their full potential individually, but the bigger picture is even more dramatic because these tools are not then working off of each other. So it's not always a case of replacing tools. It's not a case of necessarily, going through and consolidating platforms down, although that can be part of it. Sometimes it is just a case of actually we've got loads of valuable information in our customer service portal. Wouldn't it be useful if the sales team could see it, or the marketing team, and so on? And it sounds very simple, but so many people are not doing this properly.
Yeah. Okay. So how are we to de-silo? How are we to, it's all well and good saying, well, you need to allow the marketing people to look at the customer service data and have salespeople understand what's going on in this other area and what the prospect has been interacting with marketing content. Okay, easy to say. Why is it not being done so far?
I think sometimes it is difficult to achieve. I think, particularly internally in organizations that have any kind of complexity to their structure, it can be not as straightforward as it sounds. So sometimes it comes down to ownership. So which teams own which processes and which systems within the business, and therefore what are their priorities, what are their goals. Ultimately, if you've got data siloed in a sales tool and the sales team are tasked to close as many deals as possible, clearly their focus is not going to be on, oh, wouldn't it be useful if we get some of this data back to the marketing team? They don't particularly care about the marketing team's goals, and that is often what we see. And again, that's not the way it should be. They should all be working towards that single aligned set of goals,
Yeah.
and therefore they should care what the marketing team want to do and what data they've got access to. So it's by having that top down change of approach about things like what are the goals and how do we align teams behind goals as your starting point, it will then quite quickly show you that we need to go through and we need to rethink how we're
Yeah.
sharing this data back between. So
Yeah.
is it integrations? Is it consolidation of platforms? Yes,
Yeah.
it could be both of those things, but it will be different for every organization we look at.
I think where we've got to with this technology and this things where we've got different people buying different elements and they're not connected and there's somebody not driving connectivity between systems. I actually think that's a legacy from this move over recent times, and I've been in the industry for longer than I want to admit, to like shadow IT, if you like, that it's
Mm.
marketing leaders and sales leaders and customer service leaders buying technology. Whereas if I think back 20 plus years into the times of on-premise technology. There's a database sitting on a server and IT manage the computers. And if you have a problem with your computer, you basically go and talk to IT and they solve it. And IT are the only people that buy technology. That was quite coordinated, but also it was quite sluggish. And I think that one of the things about SaaS tools being purchased by marketing and revenue leaders is that IT didn't understand what actually made a good tool as they got closer to sort of substituting people's time in these different elements. It wasn't just the sort of really big
Yeah.
structural stuff. But I think that the shadow IT culture in businesses has led to fragmentation of purchase decisions and fragmentation of management because you go into IT companies, they sort of manage the underlying network and people's device infrastructure, but they kind of have to end up signing off on what marketing and sales are doing and customer service are doing, and there isn't that joined up thinking in a lot of instances. Would you think that?
Yeah, I do. I agree. And I was thinking as well when you're talking about the kind of the IT world, there was that whole nobody ever got fired for buying IBM thing. It's kind of that, like you say, that's rolled into things like Salesforce because it became a, well, obviously you buy Salesforce and Salesforce does a job. There are plenty of reasons to buy something like Salesforce, and there certainly were more reasons 10, 15 years ago to be thinking that way. And that's not necessarily the problem in itself. The problem is that isn't always then connected to whatever the marketing team are using or whatever the customer success team are using. And it's that disjointed approach and the mentality behind those purchasing decisions that has led to that,
Yeah,
not necessarily the individual decisions themselves.
yeah,
And that's, I think, what's put a lot of companies in a position where often leadership has changed in that time and
yeah,
they're just not aware of what's in use across the business. And that's an interesting one when
yeah,
we have business owners coming to us saying, I just don't know what the teams are using.
yeah. I think we could probably do a whole episode on de-siloing, but
Yeah.
I don't want to dominate this, which we want to talk about extracting value from existing tech and just siloing being the other thing. People's and process, like this is a big thing for talking technology, but it's humans that use that technology. Seeing in terms of how people should approach the people and process element when it comes to extracting this value from the tech.
Yeah, it's a big area. And I think for us, it's become very much a case of approaching how the people are using the technology is just as important as which technology is being picked. And it goes all the way back to the very start of that relationship of basic training, ensuring adoption. I mean, the adoption one is probably the most frustrating one we see for a lot of businesses where the technology's there, it's probably configured quite well. Maybe it isn't, but generally speaking, the technology might be doing what it's meant to be doing, but people just aren't using it, or they're using it to the least amount that they can. And often that's just because they've not been given the empowerment to do that. They haven't been managed correctly to do that, or maybe when it was first set up, it wasn't achieving what it should be doing, which is making lives easier. So the adoption's a massive one. Just having a top-down review of who is using tools.
Yeah.
Are they empowered to use the tools? Do the tools actually make their lives better? And then driving that adoption, that's key.
Yeah, yeah. I'm smiling because I was recalling the conversation that I think we had when we asked the question of that potential client in the discussion. We said, well, why do you want to replace your current CRM? And the answer was because nobody uses it. And it was
Yeah.
like, so it wasn't anything to do with the technology per se, other than nobody's using it. And so, yeah, I think that was a combo of configuration as well as adoption.
And we see people who've made those decisions to bring in, let's be honest, not cheap platforms,
Yeah,
and then they're not getting used properly, but they don't want to be the one to hold their hand up and say, "Oh, I know I recommended this in, and but I think it's wrong. We need to change it now." No one wants to be that person. Sometimes that has to happen.
yeah, but that said, I think that adoption can be solved by intelligent training and I don't like to use the term too much, but change management because that it's changing habits, isn't it? And I don't think people are putting enough thought into actually changing people's habits, are they?
No, and the thing is as well, it's doing it across the business because ultimately, if you've got key players in a business, whether they are the sales guy that's been there 25 years or whether it be the CEO or whatever it is, if they're not changing, the people directly around them are not going to change either. And then you start to get that ripple effect of people going, oh, well, if sales isn't changing or if senior management isn't changing, we
Yeah,
won't, because what's the point? And ultimately, like you say, that change management of saying, actually, across the business,
yeah,
this is what we're saying is the process now. It seems like such a simple approach, but it is fundamental to making this work.
yeah,
And there's training elements that go with that, making sure that the actual end users know how to use the thing that we're trying to get them to do. But I think more importantly, it's getting people to actually adopt it.
yeah. No, I'm with you on that. And I do think that often we underestimate the human psyche of habits. Like
Mm.
people who have tried to break habits, things like smoking or something like that. And I appreciate there's also a chemical addiction in smoking, but habits are really hard to break. And people, I don't think enough about people's working day as a set of habits. And
Mm.
actually, how do you re-anchor habits? I'm a big believer, and I've read a number of books about how to actually evolve habits and change habits and habit anchoring and things like that. But I think that's where smart thinking about adoption needs to really start with
Yeah.
human behaviors.
I think when someone asks the question of why do you do it that way, and the response is, we've always done it that way,
Yeah,
there's a problem.
yeah, for sure. Okay, so if we're going to unlock the value in the technology for people, what's the action point here on the human element? What would you say? Something that they could maybe do today, which would unlock some value from that element.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very human approach, but I think it's talking to the different levels of people within the business. So, talk to key department team leaders, talk to end users, try and understand where those points of friction are,
Yep.
try and understand where there's common themes of people saying, oh, I can't see this, or we can't do that, and really listen to those statements when people say, oh, we can't do that because. Because so often the because will be something like, because sales do that, or because we don't have access to that. And it will start to quite quickly make you realize, oh, well, here's the pattern. Everybody is essentially saying the same thing from a different angle.
Yeah.
And we need to then address the processes that underlie those parts of the business. And again, align it with the goals. There's no point trying to tackle things that are not going to be driving you towards your big goals. And therefore, start there. Start with our goals are X, whether it's growth, scaling the business, whether it's revenue, and then what are the processes that are not functioning to drive those goals.
Has that got to come from the CEO, or is it possible for an area's responsibility to make this? Because you just talked about the reluctance of, oh, well, if they're not doing it, I don't want to do it. How do you get buy-in then?
It can be difficult. I think having CEO, having anybody at the top of the business bought in is key. But I think the big thing that we see a lot of is that internally people have their own biases, they have their attachments to the way that they do things within their part of the business. And where we would typically add value is we come in as that external voice that can look at things very objectively, understand what the problems are, not have years of sort of frustration of not being able to get the systems or the processes to do what they want to do, and bring people to the table to have that discussion. Because it really is a cross business discussion of where is the value and where are the pain points.
So
Because
that,
ultimately, if you try and approach it from one side,
yeah.
you're only going to fix it from one side and you won't get that buy-in from the other side of the business essentially.
So the external player has the twin advantages of no bias within the organization towards an area or no politics, if you like. And if they're telling us they're knowledgeable, so they come in they're telling us this is best practice, so it's an informed guidance. It allows other people to align behind it rather than saying, oh, well, that's Bob in sales. He's always going on about that stuff, and they're already prejudging, whether Bob's idea
Yeah.
is brilliant or not brilliant. They're prejudging it because it's Bob's idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And whether we like it or not, there has always historically been that friction, particularly between marketing and sales, that reluctance to kind of listen to each other from the other side of the fence, as it were. And the way we're looking at it now is there isn't a fence. It's one team united behind one goal
Yeah,
and aligning the processes properly across that one team.
yeah. Okay. So just to recap for people and process, get people on board, get people aligned, break the habits and actually get them using this stuff, working back from there, the technology, de-silo. It might mean changing technologies, but actually quite often it's more about connecting technology and connecting the
Yep.
data, and then that brings us on to the data piece, which is wow, if you really looked at the data that you've got and joined it up, you could just uncover a lot of money being left on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
that's the holy trinity of revenue operations, I think.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's good. I'm glad we've covered that off. So hopefully people have found this discussion useful about getting more value from the technology. I think it was a good kind of starting point for the Revenue Rewired relaunch. We've got some exciting episodes coming up anyway, haven't we?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
So yeah, I think we can sign it off there for this one. Appreciate everybody for listening to Revenue Rewired, and remember, if you came expecting Digital Marketing Answered, it is the new name and it is the new theme. So I hope you found the conversation useful. Please do like and subscribe, follow wherever you're getting your podcasts, or if you're watching this on YouTube. And then also, if you want to have some help, you can reach out to any of the team at Innovation Visual. We're contactable through innovationvisual.com. Thanks to Chris for chatting to me today.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thanks to everybody for sparing the time to listen to us. And yeah, until next time, keep rewiring the way you think about growth.